Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel where we explore inspiring, touching, and sometimes life-changing stories. Today, I want to share with you a story that reminds us of the extraordinary power of resilience, love, and the bonds that create a family. This is the story of Thomas and Jaden, two strangers brought together by chance, who found in each other a family they never expected. So grab your tissues and settle in, because this story will take you on a journey of loss, hope, and the magic of building something beautiful from broken pieces. Don't forget to hit the like button if this story resonates with you, and subscribe so you don't miss more incredible stories to come. The diner buzzed with life as sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden rays over the bustling morning scene. Waitresses darted between tables, balancing trays laden with steaming coffee cups and breakfast plates. Conversations overlapped with the clinking of cutlery and the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. Among the chaos, Thomas sat alone in a corner booth, his presence commanding attention despite his silent demeanor. Clad in a tailored navy suit, his gold cufflinks catching the morning light, he exuded wealth and precision. A neatly folded newspaper rested on the table, untouched next to his coffee. Thomas sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the brief escape from his high-powered corporate life. He frowned at the interruption when a shadow fell across his table. Lowering his cup, he looked up to find a boy standing there. A boy no older than 9, with messy brown hair, oversized shoes, and clothes that had clearly seen better days. The boy's small hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, and his wide, fearful eyes darted nervously between Thomas and the floor. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked sharply, his tone tinged with annoyance at the intrusion. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Help my mom, please." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his initial irritation giving way to curiosity. He studied the boy for a moment, noting the desperation in his trembling stance. The boy seemed out of place in this diner, a stark contrast to the cheerful patrons enjoying their morning routines. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, softening his tone slightly. "Jaden," the boy replied, his voice shaking. Thomas sighed and set his cup down. "All right, Jaden, what's going on?" The boy hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "My mom, she's sick. She won't wake up." The weight of those words silenced Thomas. He leaned forward, scrutinizing Jaden's pale face and tear-brimmed eyes. Part of him wanted to dismiss the situation, to chalk it up to another ploy for money, but something about the boy's raw fear stopped him. "Where is she?" Thomas finally asked. "At home," Jaden said, his voice cracking. "Please, mister, she needs help." Thomas sighed again, longer this time, and glanced at his watch. He had meetings lined up for the day, important ones that couldn't afford to be rescheduled. Yet the look in Jaden's eyes pierced through his carefully constructed walls of detachment. Against his better judgment, he folded his newspaper and stood. "All right, kid. Lead the way." The boy led him through winding streets, far removed from the polished, high-rising world Thomas inhabited. The lively chatter of the diner was replaced by the grim silence of the neighborhood they entered. Cracked sidewalks and graffiti-stained walls framed their path as they approached a run-down apartment complex. Jaden climbed the stairs 2 at a time, pausing at a peeling door on the 2nd floor. "This is it," he whispered, pushing the door open. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of neglect. Thomas hesitated at the threshold, his polished shoes stark against the scuffed floorboards. A faint light seeped through a curtain, illuminating the small room. On a worn mattress in the corner lay a woman, her face pale and still. Thomas's breath caught at the sight. Jaden darted to her side, kneeling beside her. "Mom," he called softly, shaking her shoulder. "Please, wake up." The woman remained motionless. Thomas stepped closer, his heart sinking as he observed the bluish tint to her lips and the unnatural stillness of her chest. He knelt down, placing a hand gently on her wrist. It was cold. "Jaden," Thomas began, his voice firm yet kind. "We need to call for help." "No," Jaden cried, his voice rising in panic. He clung to his mother's arm as though his sheer will could bring her back. "You can't. They'll take me away." Thomas's chest tightened at the boy's desperation. He knew what Jaden meant. Calling the authorities could lead to social services intervening, potentially separating the boy from what little family he had left. But leaving the situation as it wasn't an option. "Listen to me," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "I promise I won't let that happen. But your mom needs help and we can't do this alone." Jaden stared at him, tears streaming down his face. After a long pause, he nodded reluctantly. Thomas rose to his feet, pulling out his phone. He dialed emergency services, his voice steady as he relayed the situation. When the paramedics arrived, the small apartment filled with subdued activity. Jaden clung to Thomas's side, his tiny hands gripping the millionaire's tailored jacket as though it were a lifeline. A kind-faced paramedic approached them, speaking gently. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone heavy with sympathy. "There's nothing we can do. She's been gone for a while." Jaden let out a heart-wrenching wail, burying his face in Thomas's side. The older man placed a tentative hand on the boy's shoulder, unsure how to comfort him but unwilling to leave him alone in his grief. A neighbor appeared at the door, her expression one of sorrowful recognition. "I knew she was sick," the neighbor said softly. "Poor boy, he doesn't have anyone now." Thomas looked down at Jaden, the boy's frail form trembling against him. The weight of responsibility settled over him, heavier than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. In that moment, he made a decision, one that would change both their lives forever. "Come on, Jaden," Thomas said, his voice firm but gentle. "Let's get you out of here." As the responders worked quietly in the background, Thomas guided Jaden out of the apartment, shielding him from the grim scene. They stepped into the cold morning light, leaving behind the life Jaden had known and stepping into the unknown together. Thomas held Jaden's hand tightly as they stepped into the brisk morning air. The chill bit against their skin, a sharp contrast to the oppressive warmth of the apartment they had just left. Jaden hadn't spoken a word since leaving, his small frame trembling with every step. Thomas glanced down at him, his mind swirling with uncertainty. He had no experience with children, let alone one who had just lost everything. Yet, as the boy clung to his side, Thomas felt a responsibility he couldn't ignore. The sleek black car parked at the curb was a stark reminder of the world Thomas came from. Opening the passenger door, he gestured for Jaden to climb in. The boy hesitated, his eyes wide as he took in the polished leather seats and spotless interior. "It's all right," Thomas encouraged gently. "Hop in. I'll take you somewhere safe." Jaden obeyed silently, sliding into the seat and clutching the seatbelt like a lifeline. Thomas settled into the driver's seat, the hum of the engine breaking the heavy silence. The drive back to Thomas's upscale apartment was quiet except for the occasional sniffle from Jaden. Thomas tried to focus on the road, but his thoughts were racing. He had spent decades building a life defined by success and wealth, yet he'd never felt this sense of urgency to act for someone else. He glanced at Jaden in the rearview mirror, the boy staring out the window, his face pale and tear-streaked. As they pulled into the underground parking garage of Thomas's building, Jaden's eyes grew even wider. The towering skyscraper above was a world away from the crumbling apartment he had just left behind. "This is your house?" Jaden asked, his voice breaking the silence for the first time. Thomas hesitated before responding. "For now, it's your house too." Jaden didn't reply, but the look in his eyes shifted. Cautious hope flickered beneath the layers of fear and grief. Inside the apartment, Jaden stood frozen near the entryway, overwhelmed by the expansive space. The gleaming floors reflected the light streaming in from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the minimalist decor seemed almost too perfect to touch. Thomas led him further inside, opening the door to a guest bedroom. "You can stay here," Thomas said, motioning to the neatly made bed. "It's not much, but it's yours for now." Jaden stepped cautiously into the room, running his fingers over the soft comforter. For a moment, Thomas saw a flicker of curiosity in the boy's expression, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked. Jaden nodded hesitantly, and Thomas walked toward the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge. He wasn't much of a cook, but he managed to put together a simple meal: grilled cheese and tomato soup. Placing the plate in front of Jaden at the dining table, he watched as the boy ate in silence, his movements slow and deliberate. "You can talk to me, you know," Thomas said after a long pause. "I'm here to help." Jaden looked up, his big eyes clouded with doubt. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." The question hit Thomas harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, searching for the right words. "Because you reminded me of someone who needed help once and didn't get it. I can't stand by and do nothing." Jaden's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he returned to his food. Thomas didn't press further, giving the boy space to process. Over the next few days, Thomas worked to provide some semblance of normalcy for Jaden. He bought the boy clothes, toys, and school supplies, trying to fill the void left by his mother's absence. Despite Thomas's efforts, Jaden remained withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. Nights were the hardest. Jaden often woke up crying, his small frame racked with sobs that he tried to stifle. Thomas would sit with him until he fell back asleep, his presence a silent reassurance. One evening, Thomas decided to contact Rebecca, his estranged wife. They hadn't spoken in years, their marriage having crumbled under the weight of Thomas's career ambitions. Yet, she was the only person he trusted to help navigate this unfamiliar situation. The phone rang twice before Rebecca's voice answered, cool and measured. "Thomas, this is unexpected." "I need your help," he said bluntly, his tone softer than usual. Rebecca hesitated. "What's going on?" Thomas explained the situation, recounting the events that had led to Jaden staying with him. He expected skepticism or even scorn, but instead, Rebecca surprised him. "Thomas, this isn't something you can do alone," she said. "You're not exactly the nurturing type." "I know," Thomas admitted. "But I have to try. This kid has no one else." Rebecca sighed. "All right, I'll come by tomorrow and see how I can help." The next day, Rebecca arrived at the apartment, her presence filling the room with an air of calm authority. She knelt down to Jaden's level, her kind eyes meeting his wary ones. "Hi, Jaden. I'm Rebecca," she said warmly. "Thomas told me about your mom. I'm so sorry for what you're going through." Jaden didn't respond, but he didn't shy away either. A small victory, Thomas thought. As Rebecca began organizing things, calling counselors, arranging doctor's appointments, and discussing school options, Thomas felt a twinge of gratitude. She was better at this than he was, her maternal instincts still intact despite their years apart. One afternoon, Thomas found Jaden sitting by the large windows, a sketch pad in his lap. The boy had been drawing quietly for hours, lost in his own world. Curious, Thomas approached him. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. Jaden hesitated before showing him the page. It was a drawing of a house, surrounded by trees and sunlight. The details were intricate, the lines careful and precise. "It's where I want to live one day," Jaden said softly. a place where I won't be scared anymore." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat, struck by the boy's quiet resilience. He ruffled Jaden's hair lightly. "We'll make sure you have that someday, I promise." For the first time, Jaden gave him a small, tentative smile, a glimmer of trust forming between them. But the road ahead was far from easy. As Thomas began the process of filing for temporary guardianship, the challenges piled up. Legal hurdles, home evaluations, and court hearings loomed over them. Social workers questioned his motives, scrutinizing his lack of familial ties to Jaden. Yet despite the odds, Thomas remained resolute. He knew he wasn't perfect. He knew he couldn't replace Jaden's mother. But as he watched the boy begin to heal, a determination stronger than anything he'd felt in his corporate career took hold. This wasn't just about saving Jaden. It was about redeeming himself, about proving that even the most guarded hearts could learn to love. The days turned into weeks, and Jaden began to adjust to the rhythm of life in Thomas's apartment. Though his grief still lingered, the boy seemed more at ease, even daring to smile now and then. Thomas, too, found himself settling into a new role, one he'd never imagined for himself. The boy's presence was both a challenge and a strange comfort, disrupting his orderly life in ways that felt unexpectedly fulfilling. However, beneath the surface of their budding bond, the weight of the unresolved loomed large. The temporary calm was a fragile thing, threatened by the practicalities and scrutiny of their situation. Thomas knew the road ahead wasn't just about providing a home. It was about protecting Jaden from a system that might not understand his needs. One morning, a knock at the door jolted Thomas from his thoughts. He opened it to find a stern-faced woman holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clark, a representative from Child Services sent to conduct the initial evaluation for guardianship. "This is standard procedure," Mrs. Clark explained as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the immaculate apartment. "We need to ensure that this is a suitable environment for Jaden." Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. He had anticipated this visit, yet the invasive nature of it unsettled him. Mrs. Clark walked through the apartment, taking notes and occasionally asking questions about his income, lifestyle, and reasons for wanting to care for Jaden. Jaden stood in the doorway of his room, watching the woman warily. His small hands gripped the frame as if anchoring himself to the familiar. "Hi, Jaden," Mrs. Clark said, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "How are you feeling here? Do you like staying with Mr. Thomas?" Jaden glanced at Thomas, his face unreadable, before nodding slowly. "He's nice," he said softly. Mrs. Clark smiled, though her professional demeanor remained intact. "That's good to hear. Can you tell me about your mom? Were you close? I would love to hear what you think, so leave a comment below. What was your favorite part of this video?" At the mention of his mother, Jaden's face crumpled. He took a step back, retreating into his room without another word. Thomas moved to follow, but Mrs. Clark stopped him. It's all right. These are sensitive topics. We'll need to revisit them later, but for now I have enough to move forward." As Mrs. Clark left, the tension in the apartment lingered. Thomas found Jaden curled up on his bed, his sketch pad discarded beside him. The boy's silence spoke volumes, and Thomas sat beside him, unsure of how to bridge the gap. "They're just trying to help," Thomas said eventually, his voice gentle. "But I won't let anyone take you away, Jaden. You have my word." Jaden looked up at him, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Do you think she's watching me? My mom, I mean?" Thomas paused, taken aback by the question. "I think she is," he said finally, "and I think she'd be proud of how brave you are." Jaden didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. It was enough to reassure Thomas that for now, they were on the right path. The following weeks brought more challenges. Meetings with lawyers, home inspections, and court preparations consumed Thomas's time. He leaned heavily on Rebecca, whose presence had become a stabilizing force. She helped Thomas navigate the intricacies of the legal process, often taking the lead when his frustration threatened to boil over. One evening, as they sat in the living room discussing the next steps, Jaden approached them hesitantly. He held a piece of paper in his hand, which he handed to Rebecca. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it. "It's, for the judge," Jane said quietly. In case they ask me what I want." Rebecca's eyes scanned the letter, her expression softening as she read. She passed it to Thomas, who read it aloud. "Dear Judge, I want to stay with Mr. Thomas. He takes care of me and doesn't get mad when I have bad dreams. He helps me draw and makes grilled cheese the way my mom used to. I don't want to go anywhere else." "Thank you." Thomas's voice faltered as he finished reading. He looked at Jaden, whose face was a mixture of hope and fear. "You didn't have to do this, Jaden," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "but it means a lot." Jaden shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I just wanted to make sure they know." The day of the court hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. Thomas and Jaden sat side by side in the courtroom, the weight of the proceedings pressing heavily on them. Mrs. Clark presented her findings, emphasizing the unorthodox nature of the arrangement. "This situation is highly unusual," she said. "Mr. Thomas has no prior connection to the child, and while his intentions appear genuine, the court must consider Jaden's long-term stability." The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority, turned her attention to Jaden. "Jaden, do you feel safe with Mr. Thomas? Do you want to stay with him?" Jaden hesitated, his small hands clutching the edge of the table. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He cares about me." The courtroom fell silent. The judge studied Jaden for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. I am granting temporary guardianship to Mr. Thomas, pending further evaluations. Take care of each other." Relief washed over Thomas, but it was Jaden's reaction that struck him most. The boy turned to him, tears streaming down his face, and hugged him tightly. It was the first time Jaden had initiated contact, and Thomas's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and responsibility. As they left the courtroom, Rebecca met them outside, her expression warm. "You did it," she said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "But this is just the beginning." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on Jaden, who was clutching the letter he'd written. "I know, but we'll face whatever comes next. Together." The three of them walked toward the car, the weight of the day slowly lifting. For the first time, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Jaden, but for himself. In helping the boy, he had rediscovered a part of himself he thought had been lost forever. And in Jaden's quiet resilience, he saw the strength they would need to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ride home from the courthouse was quieter than Thomas expected. Jaden sat in the passenger seat, clutching his letter tightly, as though it were a shield against the uncertainty of the future. Though the court's decision was a victory, Thomas knew it was only a step in a much longer journey. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, ones he hadn't fully prepared for but was determined to face. Pulling into the underground parking garage, Thomas glanced at Jaden. "You okay?" he asked softly. Jaden nodded, though his grip on the letter didn't loosen. "Yeah, just tired." "Me too, kid," Thomas replied with a faint smile. Back in the apartment, the atmosphere felt lighter, even if only slightly. Jaden disappeared into his room, leaving Thomas standing alone in the spacious living room. He sank onto the couch, his mind swirling with the weight of everything that had transpired. The court had granted him temporary guardianship, but the scrutiny from child services wasn't over. He would need to prove he could provide a stable and loving environment for Jaden, something he had never imagined doing before now. As Thomas stared out the large windows, the city lights twinkling against the night sky, Rebecca's voice broke his thoughts. She had stayed to help, her presence a steadying force during the turbulent days. "You did good today," she said, setting a cup of tea on the table in front of him. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't know if it's enough. What if I can't give him what he needs? I've spent my whole life chasing success, not raising kids. Rebecca sat down beside him, her expression softer than he remembered. Thomas, no one's expecting you to have all the answers right away. You're doing something incredible just by showing up for him. That's more than most people would do. He nodded, but doubt still gnawed at him. It doesn't feel like enough. He's lost so much already. I can't let him down. You won't, Rebecca said firmly. But you need to remember you're not alone in this. Let people help you. Thomas met her gaze, gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. Thank you for being here. Later that evening, Thomas checked on Jaden, finding him sitting cross-legged on his bed, sketchpad in hand. The boy was drawing intently, his face lit by the glow of a small desk lamp. Thomas lingered in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. What are you working on? He asked, his voice gentle. Jaden hesitated, then turned the sketchpad toward Thomas. It was a drawing of the courtroom from earlier that day, rendered in striking detail. The judge, Thomas, and Jaden himself were all depicted with careful precision, though the colors were muted, grays and blacks dominating the scene. It's how I felt today, Jaden explained quietly. Scared, but safe too. Thomas's chest tightened. He knelt beside the bed, studying the drawing more closely. You're really talented, you know that? Jaden shrugged, his cheeks flushing slightly. My mom used to say that too. Thomas reached out, resting a hand on Jaden's shoulder. She was right, and I think she'd be proud of how brave you were today. Jaden looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting in the faintest smile. Thanks! The next few days marked the beginning of a new chapter. Thomas threw himself into creating a routine for Jaden, something stable and consistent. He enrolled the boy in counseling sessions to help him process his grief, arranged for tutoring to catch him up on schoolwork, and encouraged him to pursue his love of art. Slowly, the apartment transformed from a bachelor's retreat into a home, with Jaden's sketches decorating the walls and his laughter occasionally filling the space. One afternoon, Thomas returned from a meeting to find Jaden sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by colored pencils and paper. The boy was drawing a vibrant landscape, a sunny meadow with wildflowers, and a small cottage in the distance. What's this? Thomas asked, setting his briefcase down. It's where I want to live someday, Jaden replied, his voice steady. Someplace quiet and happy. Thomas smiled, his heart warming at the boy's vision. It's beautiful. You'll have that one day, Jaden. I'll make sure of it. But not every moment was easy. There were nights when Jaden's grief resurfaced, his sobs echoing through the apartment. Thomas would sit with him, offering quiet reassurance until the boy fell back asleep. Those moments reminded him of the enormity of his promise, that this wasn't just about providing a roof over Jaden's head. It was about being there, truly being there, through the highs and lows. Rebecca continued to be a guiding presence, visiting regularly and helping Thomas navigate the challenges of guardianship. One evening, as they sat discussing upcoming court evaluations, she posed a question that caught him off guard. Have you thought about what this means for your life long term? She asked. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Jaden isn't just a temporary responsibility, Thomas. He's going to be part of your life for years to come. Are you ready for that? The weight of her words settled over him. He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, focusing instead on the immediate hurdles. But as he looked toward Jaden's room, where the boy was humming softly while drawing, he realized there was no turning back. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted, but I know I want to be. Rebecca smiled faintly. That's a good start. The first real test of their new normal came when Thomas took Jaden to an art class. The boy had expressed interest in learning more about drawing, and Thomas saw it as an opportunity to help him build confidence. Watching Jaden interact with other kids, a cautious smile on his face, Thomas felt a surge of pride. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. After the class, Jaden bounded over to Thomas, holding up a sketch of a cityscape. "Look what I made," he said, his excitement shining through. Thomas examined the drawing, his smile genuine. "It's incredible, Jaden. You've got a real gift." The boy beamed, and for the first time, Thomas saw a spark of hope in his eyes, a glimpse of the future they were building together. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas began to see the changes in both of them. Jaden's walls were slowly coming down, his laughter becoming more frequent, and Thomas, once consumed by work and ambition, found himself prioritizing moments he would have once overlooked, helping with homework, watching movies together, or simply listening as Jaden talked about his day. Through it all, Thomas realized that taking responsibility wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every single day and proving to Jaden that he wasn't alone. Together, they were building something new, something neither of them had expected, but both desperately needed. The memory of the courtroom lingered in Thomas's mind as he stepped into the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner for Jaden. The boy sat at the dining table, sketchpad in front of him, quietly working on another of his intricate drawings. The soft scratching of pencil on paper was the only sound in the apartment, a reminder of the fragile peace they were trying to build. But as Thomas set the plates on the table and called Jaden over, the sharp knock on the door disrupted the moment. Thomas froze for a second before crossing the room to open it. Standing there was a paramedic, her expression calm but concerned. Behind her was a neighbor, the same kind woman who had consoled Jaden the day his mother passed. Seeing her now brought a rush of memories Thomas wasn't ready to confront. "Mr. Thomas," the paramedic began, her voice steady, "we received a call from one of your neighbors. They were worried about Jaden." Thomas frowned, his mind racing. "Worried? Why?" The neighbor stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. I'm sorry, Thomas. I didn't mean to overstep. But I noticed how quiet it's been, and with everything Jaden's been through, I thought it might be good to have someone check in." Thomas felt a pang of frustration, but quickly masked it. He glanced back at Jaden, who was watching the exchange from the dining table, his eyes wide with apprehension. The last thing Thomas wanted was for the boy to feel scrutinized or unsafe. "Thank you," Thomas said, forcing calm into his voice. "But Jaden is fine. He's adjusting, and I'm doing everything I can to support him." The paramedic nodded, her tone softening. "That's good to hear. But if you don't mind, I'd like to ask Jaden a few questions, just to make sure he feels safe and cared for." Thomas hesitated, his protective instincts flaring, but he knew resisting would only raise more concerns. "All right," he said after a moment, "but I'd like to be present." The paramedic smiled gently, of course. Thomas guided the paramedic to the living room, where Jaden sat, clutching his sketch pad. He looked up at her, his expression cautious, but curious. The paramedic knelt down to his eye level, her kind demeanor easing some of the tension. "Hi, Jaden," she said warmly. "I'm Emily. I just wanted to see how you're doing. Is that okay?" Jaden glanced at Thomas, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Okay," the boy whispered. Emily smiled. "Can you tell me about your drawings? They look amazing." Jaden hesitated before flipping open his sketchpad to show her a recent piece, a vibrant meadow with a small cottage in the center. Emily admired it genuinely, her praise coaxing a shy smile from Jaden. "This is beautiful," she said. "You must have a great imagination." Jaden shrugged, his voice soft. "It's where I want to live someday." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lovely dream. Do you feel like this apartment is a safe place for you right now?" Jaden's eyes flickered to Thomas before returning to Emily. "Yeah. Mr. Thomas takes care of me. He makes grilled cheese like my mom used to." Emily's smile widened, and she glanced at Thomas. "That's wonderful to hear." After a few more questions, Emily stood and turned to Thomas. "You're doing a great job," she said quietly. "It's clear Jaden feels safe here. If you ever need additional resources or support, don't hesitate to reach out." Thomas exhaled, some of the tension in his chest easing. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." As Emily left, the neighbor lingered, her expression apologetic. "I hope you're not upset," she said. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Thomas offered her a small smile. "I understand. You were looking out for him. That's what matters." Later that evening, as the apartment settled into its usual quiet, Thomas found Jaden sitting by the windows, staring out at the city lights. He approached cautiously, not wanting to disturb the boy's thoughts. "You did great today," Thomas said, sitting beside him. "I know it's not easy answering all those questions." Jaden hugged his knees to his chest, his gaze distant. "Are they going to take me away?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. "No," he said firmly. "No one has taken you anywhere. I promised, remember? I'm here for you, Jaden, no matter what." The boy turned to him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I am scared," he admitted. "What if something happens? What if you decide you don't want me?" Thomas reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me now, kid." Jaden's lips quirked into the faintest smile, and Thomas felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he had taken on this responsibility. The boy needed someone who wouldn't give up on him, and Thomas was determined to be that person. The following day, Thomas took Jaden to a counselor for their first session. Though the boy was hesitant at first, he eventually opened up, sharing bits and pieces of his memories with his mother. Thomas waited outside, his heart heavy with the knowledge of how much pain Jaden had endured. When the session ended, the counselor assured Thomas that Jaden was making progress, albeit slowly. On the drive home, Jaden surprised Thomas by asking if they could stop at an art store. "I want to get more colors," he said, "for my drawings." Thomas smiled, pleased by the boy's newfound interests. "Of course," he said. "Anything you need." As the weeks went on, Jaden's confidence grew. He started talking more, laughing more, and even attending art classes at a local community center. Thomas watched the transformation with a mix of pride and relief, knowing they were moving in the right direction. But the shadows of the past still lingered. Thomas often found himself awake late at night, thinking about the challenges ahead. Guardianship wasn't permanent yet, and the weight of that uncertainty gnawed at him. Still, he resolved to push forward, one day at a time. Because Jaden wasn't just a responsibility, he was a promise Thomas intended to keep no matter what. The weeks that followed were a patchwork of small victories and subtle shifts. Jaden began to settle into the rhythms of his new life, and Thomas, who had once thrived on strict schedules and professional detachment, found himself learning the art of patience. What started as a temporary arrangement was evolving into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thomas's apartment as he set 2 bowls of cereal on the table. It wasn't the elaborate breakfast spread he used to imagine serving if he ever had kids, but Jaden didn't seem to mind. The boy shuffled into the kitchen, still sleepy-eyed, and sat at the table. "Good morning," Thomas said, trying to inject some cheer into his voice. "Morning," Jaden mumbled, spooning cereal into his mouth. Thomas sat across from him, sipping coffee. "Big day today. You start art class. Are you excited?" Jaden shrugged, not looking up from his bowl. I guess." "You'll do great," Thomas said, offering him an encouraging smile. "Just be yourself." Jaden's lips quirked in the faintest smile, a sign that he was warming up to the idea. Though he rarely voiced it, Thomas could see the boy's passion for drawing in every sketch he made. He wanted to nurture that spark, to give Jaden something to hold on to in a world that had taken so much from him. Later that afternoon, Thomas walked Jaden to the community art center. The building was modest, with colorful murals decorating the outside walls. Inside, the smell of paint and the sound of cheerful chatter filled the air. Jaden clung to Thomas's side, his small hand gripping the edge of his jacket. "Do you want me to stay?" Thomas asked, sensing the boy's apprehension. Jaden shook his head but didn't let go. "No, I'll be okay, I think." Thomas knelt to Jaden's level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this, Jaden. Just have fun. I'll be right outside if you need me." Jaden nodded, his grip loosening. He hesitated for a moment before walking toward the instructor, a kind-looking woman who greeted him warmly. Thomas watched as the boy joined the other kids, his movements tentative but hopeful. While Jaden attended class, Thomas waited in the nearby cafe, sipping another cup of coffee as he worked on his laptop. He glanced at the time every few minutes, wondering how Jaden was doing. When the class ended, Jaden came bounding out of the room, his face lit with an excitement Thomas hadn't seen before. "Look," Jaden said, thrusting a piece of paper toward Thomas. It was a watercolor painting of a tree with vibrant green leaves and a bright blue sky. The colors were vivid, bursting with life. "This is amazing," Thomas said, genuinely impressed. "You're really talented, Jaden." Jaden beamed, his cheeks flushing with pride. "The teacher said I have a good eye for color." "She's right," Thomas replied. "You should frame this. It's a masterpiece." Jaden's smile widened, and in that moment, Thomas felt a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. It wasn't just pride, it was connection, a bond that was slowly forming between them. Back at the apartment, Thomas helped Jaden pin his painting to the wall in his bedroom. The boy insisted on placing it next to his sketches, creating a small gallery of his work. As Jaden admired the display, Thomas couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude. The boy's resilience amazed him, even in the face of unimaginable loss. "You know," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe, "you're pretty incredible." Jaden turned to him, his expression curious. "Why?" "Because you've been through so much, and you're still finding ways to smile," Thomas replied. "That's not easy to do." Jaden looked down, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "It's because you're helping me. My mom would have liked you." The words caught Thomas off guard, hitting him with a wave of unexpected emotion. "Thanks, Jaden. That means a lot." As the days turned into weeks, their routines became more natural. Thomas and Jaden found themselves sharing small moments that slowly brought them closer together. They cooked dinner together, laughing when Jaden accidentally added too much salt to the pasta. They played board games in the evenings, Jaden's competitive streak emerging with every roll of the dice. And on weekends, Thomas took Jaden to the park, where the boys sketched everything from towering trees to playful dogs. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Jaden leaned against Thomas without a word. It was the first time the boy had initiated physical closeness, and Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He placed a tentative arm around Jaden's shoulders, silently vowing to protect him. But not every day was easy. There were still moments when Jaden retreated into himself, overwhelmed by grief or fear. Thomas learned to recognize those signs, how the boy's shoulders hunched, how his gaze turned distant. On those days, Thomas would sit with him in silence, letting Jaden know he wasn't alone. One particularly rough night, Jaden woke up crying, his sobs echoing through the apartment. Thomas rushed to his room, finding the boy curled into a ball beneath his blanket. "Jaden," Thomas said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong?" "I miss her," Jaden whispered, his voice muffled. "I miss my mom." Thomas's chest tightened. He reached out, rubbing Jaden's back gently. "I know, buddy. I miss her for you too." Jaden peeked out from under the blanket, his tear-streaked face filled with vulnerability. "You think she's mad at me? For being happy sometimes?" Thomas's heart broke at the question. "No, Jaden, she'd never be mad at you. She'd want you to be happy. That's how she'd know you're okay." Jaden sniffled, his tears slowing. "You think so?" "I know so," Thomas said firmly, "and I think she'd be really proud of how strong you are." Jaden nodded, his breathing steadying. Thomas stayed with him until he fell back asleep, his small hand clutching Thomas's as though it were a lifeline. Over time, those moments of pain grew less frequent, replaced by laughter and hope. The bond between Thomas and Jaden deepened, no longer defined by obligation, but by genuine care. They were building something new, something neither of them had expected, but both desperately needed. For Thomas, the boy had become more than a responsibility. He was a reminder of what truly mattered: love, resilience, and the power of showing up for someone when they needed it most. For Jaden, Thomas wasn't just a guardian. He was becoming family. Despite the growing bond between Thomas and Jaden, their days were not without challenges. Beneath the laughter and shared moments, grief lingered like a shadow, and it often emerged in the quietest hours. Jaden's emotions were a whirlwind, moments of joy abruptly interrupted by waves of sadness and fear. And for Thomas, navigating this emotional terrain was new and daunting. It started one night when Thomas found Jaden sitting by the window, staring out at the twinkling city lights. The boy hadn't eaten much at dinner, brushing off Thomas's attempts to coax him into talking. Now he sat curled up in the corner of the room, clutching his sketchpad tightly against his chest. "Jaden," Thomas called softly, stepping into the room. "You all right?" The boy didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, his eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "I miss her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Thomas's heart clenched. He sat down beside Jaden, his presence meant to reassure. "I know you do," he said gently. "It's okay to miss her." "Ah." Jaden looked down at his sketchpad, tracing invisible lines on the cover. "It's like some days I can't even remember her voice. What if I forget her?" Thomas hesitated, unsure of what to say. He wanted to fix it, to take away the boy's pain, but he knew there were no easy answers. Instead, he wrapped an arm around Jaden's small shoulders. "You won't forget her," he said firmly. "She's always going to be a part of you, in your heart, in your memories. And I'll help you remember, okay?" Jaden nodded slowly, leaning into Thomas's side. It was a small step, but it felt monumental in their fragile journey together. The emotional struggles didn't stop there. Over the weeks, Jaden began to have vivid nightmares, dark fragments of his fears and grief playing out in his dreams. He would wake up crying, his small frame trembling, and Thomas would rush to his side. One particularly rough night, Jaden screamed in his sleep, the sound piercing through the quiet apartment. Thomas bolted out of bed and found the boy tangled in his blanket, tears streaming down his face. "Jaden," Thomas said, sitting on the edge of the bed and gently shaking his shoulder. It's just a dream. You're safe." Jaden's eyes snapped open, wide with panic. It took him a moment to realize where he was, and when he did, he collapsed into Thomas's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I was scared," Jaden choked out. I thought I lost her again. Thomas tightened his hold, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm here," he said quietly. "You're not alone, Jaden. I've got you." The boy clung to him like a lifeline, and Thomas stayed with him until the sobs subsided. He didn't leave the room that night, pulling a chair beside the bed and keeping watch as Jaden finally drifted back to sleep. During the day, Jaden's struggles showed in other ways. He would sometimes retreat into silence, refusing to draw or engage with anything he normally enjoyed. Thomas learned to recognize the signs, the way Jaden's shoulders slumped, the way his gaze grew distant. On one such day, Thomas decided to take a different approach. He found Jaden sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Thomas sat down beside him, holding up a set of tickets. "What's this?" Jaden asked, glancing at them. "It's a surprise," Thomas said with a grin. "I thought we could use a change of scenery." That afternoon, Thomas took Jaden to the art museum downtown. The boy's initial reluctance melted away as they walked through the grand halls, surrounded by vibrant paintings and intricate sculptures. Jaden's eyes lit up with curiosity, and he started asking questions about the artists and their work. At one point, they stopped in front of a massive landscape painting, rolling hills under a golden sky. Jaden stared at it for a long time before whispering, "It's kind of like the place I draw." Thomas nodded. "It is. Maybe one day, your paintings will hang in a museum like this." Jaden's cheeks flushed, and he looked down shyly. "You really think so?" "I know so," Thomas said confidently. "You've got the talent. You just have to keep believing in yourself." While moments like these brought hope, Thomas wasn't immune to his own struggles. He often found himself awake late at night, wrestling with doubts and fears. Was he doing enough for Jaden? Could he truly give the boy the life he deserved? These thoughts weighed heavily on him, but he kept them hidden, not wanting Jaden to sense his uncertainty. One evening, Rebecca came by to check in. She noticed the exhaustion etched on Thomas's face and didn't hold back. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she said, her tone firm but kind. "You need to take care of yourself too, Thomas." "I can't let him down," Thomas replied, running a hand through his hair. "He's been through too much already." "You're not letting him down," Rebecca reassured. "But you can't do this alone. Lean on the people who care about you, who care about him." Thomas sighed, nodding reluctantly. He knew she was right, even if it was hard to admit. Jaden needed him to be strong, but that didn't mean he had to carry the weight alone. Slowly, with time and support, both Thomas and Jaden began to find their footing. Jaden started opening up more during his counseling sessions, sharing memories of his mother and expressing his fears. His sketches became brighter, more hopeful, reflecting his gradual healing. Thomas, too, learned to let go of some of his anxieties. He embraced the unpredictability of their life together, finding joy in the little moments, cooking breakfast, playing board games, or simply sitting together on the couch. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, Jaden hesitated in the hallway. "Thomas?" he said quietly. "Yeah?" Thomas replied, turning to him. "Do you think she'd be okay with me being happy even without her?" Thomas knelt down, looking Jaden in the eyes. "I think she'd want nothing more than for you to be happy, Jaden. She loved you, and she'd be proud of how strong you are." Jaden nodded, his lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "Thanks," he whispered, before heading to his room. Thomas watched him go, a sense of peace washing over him. The journey wasn't over, but they were finding their way. Together. And that, Thomas realized, was what mattered most. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Thomas and Jaden grew stronger, but the specter of uncertainty loomed over them. While Jaden began to smile more and draw with renewed passion, Thomas couldn't ignore the looming reality. His guardianship was still temporary, and the final decision rested in the hands of the court. He knew the battle ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to fight for the boy who had come to mean so much to him. It started with a letter. A thick envelope arrived one crisp morning, bearing the official seal of Child Services. Thomas opened it at the kitchen table, his hand steady but his heart pounding. Inside were the details of the upcoming court hearing. The date, the required documentation, and a list of questions that would likely come up. Rebecca, who had stopped by for coffee, read over his shoulder. "They're going to scrutinize everything," she said, her tone both reassuring and cautionary. "Your finances, your home, your history, everything." Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. "I expected that. I just didn't think it would feel so personal." "It's because it is personal," Rebecca said. "They're trying to decide what's best for Jaden, and right now you're the best thing that's happened to him." Thomas glanced toward the living room where Jaden was sprawled on the floor, happily sketching a colorful cityscape. "He deserves stability," Thomas said quietly. "He deserves to stay where he feels safe." "Then let's make sure the court sees that," Rebecca replied firmly. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. Thomas met with lawyers, gathered character references, and worked tirelessly to prove that he could provide Jaden with a stable and loving home. Rebecca helped organize the mountain of paperwork, and even Jaden's art teacher wrote a glowing letter about the boy's progress and newfound confidence. Still, doubts plagued Thomas. Late at night, after Jaden had gone to bed, he would sit in the living room, staring at the neatly stacked documents. He couldn't shake the fear that the court might decide Jaden belonged elsewhere, perhaps with distant relatives or in a foster home. "What if they don't think I'm enough?" he confessed to Rebecca one evening. "They will," she assured him, "because you are enough. You've given Jaden something no one else could, a sense of belonging." The day of the hearing arrived, and the air was heavy with tension. Thomas dressed in his sharpest suit, determined to present himself as composed and capable. Jaden wore a new shirt and tie Thomas had bought for him, though the boy fidgeted nervously as they waited outside the courtroom. "You don't have to be scared," Thomas said, kneeling to Jaden's level. "Just tell the truth. That's all that matters." Jaden nodded, though his hands clutched his sketch pad tightly. "What if they don't let me stay with you?" Thomas placed a steady hand on Jaden's shoulder. "I'm not giving up on you, kid. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out together." Jaden's eyes welled with tears, but he nodded again, his trust in Thomas unwavering. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was formal and intimidating. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority, presided over the proceedings. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze in the room as Mrs. Clark, the representative from Child Services, presented her findings. The phone rang, and Christine's timely and helpful return earned her a following. "While Mr. Thomas has shown remarkable commitment to Jaden's well-being," she began, "it's important to note that he has no prior experience as a parent. Additionally, this arrangement is unconventional, given that Mr. Thomas is not a biological relative." Thomas's lawyer countered with evidence of his dedication, testimonials from Jaden's teacher, counselor, and even neighbors who had witnessed their bond. Rebecca also took the stand, speaking passionately about Thomas's transformation and his unwavering support for Jaden. But the most powerful moment came when Jaden was asked to speak. The boy's small frame seemed even smaller as he approached the witness stand, clutching his sketch pad like a lifeline. "Jaden," the judge said kindly, "can you tell us how you feel about living with Mr. Thomas?" Jaden nodded, his voice soft but steady. "He makes me feel safe," he said, He takes care of me, and he doesn't get mad when I have bad dreams. He even helps me with my drawings." The judge smiled faintly. "And do you want to stay with Mr. Thomas?" "Yes," Jaden said, his eyes shimmering with determination. "He's my family now." The courtroom fell silent as the judge considered Jaden's words. Thomas sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the judge looked up, her expression thoughtful. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing from everyone involved," she began, "I believe it's clear that Jaden's best interests are being met under Mr. Thomas's care. Therefore, I am granting full guardianship to Mr. Thomas." Relief flooded Thomas's body, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jaden turned to him, his face breaking into a wide smile. Thomas opened his arms, and the boy ran to him, hugging him tight. "We did it, kid," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're staying home." As they left the courthouse, Rebecca joined them, her expression a mix of pride and triumph. "You fought for him," she said to Thomas, "and you won." "I didn't do it alone," Thomas replied, his gratitude evident. He glanced down at Jaden, who was holding his hand tightly. "But it was worth every second." That evening, back at the apartment, Thomas and Jaden celebrated with ice cream and pizza. They sat on the couch, laughing and reminiscing about the day. Jaden's sketch pad lay open on the coffee table, displaying a new drawing. A courtroom filled with bright colors, the figures of Thomas and Jaden at the center, surrounded by a warm golden glow. "You really captured the moment," Thomas said, admiring the drawing. Jaden grinned. "It's how I felt today, happy." Thomas ruffled the boy's hair, his heart swelling with pride. "You've got a gift, Jaden. And now we've got a lifetime to see where it takes you." For the first time in a long time, both of them felt a sense of peace. The legal battle was over, but their journey together was just beginning. They had fought for their future, and now they were ready to build it, one day at a time. The courtroom decision had brought relief, but it also marked a turning point. For Thomas and Jaden, the weeks that followed were about settling into their new reality as a family. Yet despite their growing bond, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their challenges. The weight of being Jaden's legal guardian was a responsibility he had willingly taken on, but now he was faced with an even more profound decision: how to ensure Jaden's future was not only secure, but filled with love and opportunity. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jaden was working on another of his intricate drawings. His pencil strokes were confident, his focus unwavering. Thomas, sitting nearby with a stack of papers from work, couldn't help but steal glances at the boy. Jaden's growth over the past few months had been remarkable. His once timid demeanor had been replaced by a quiet but undeniable strength. "What are you working on tonight?" Thomas asked, setting his papers aside. Jaden held up the sketch, revealing a colorful scene of a boy and a man standing in a meadow, surrounded by blooming flowers. The boy's wide grin mirrored Jaden's own, while the man's steady presence conveyed a sense of security and pride. "It's us," Jaden said simply, a hint of shyness creeping into his voice. Thomas felt his throat tighten. That's incredible, Jaden. You've got real talent." Jaden smiled, but his expression grew thoughtful. "Do you think I'll be okay, Thomas? Like, in the future?" Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I think you're going to do more than just be okay, Jaden. I think you're going to be amazing. You've already been through so much, and you're still standing. That's not just okay, that's strong." Jade nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly. But What if something happens? What if you get tired of me? The question hit Thomas harder than he expected. He took a deep breath, meeting Jaden's worried gaze. Listen to me, kid. I'm not going anywhere. I made a promise, remember? You're stuck with me. Jaden's shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away. Thanks, he said softly. That night, after Jaden had gone to bed, Thomas found himself sitting at the kitchen table, deep in thought. Rebecca's words from weeks ago echoed in his mind. This isn't just about right now. It's about the long term. Are you ready for that? He had thought he was ready, but now he realized there was one more step he needed to take to solidify their future together. The next morning, Thomas made a call to his lawyer. I want to start the adoption process, he said, his voice steady but resolute. The lawyer hesitated. Adoption is a much more complex process, Thomas. Are you sure you're ready for that commitment? I've never been more sure of anything, Thomas replied. Jaden deserves more than temporary, he deserves forever. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, home visits, and more court proceedings. Thomas didn't tell Jaden right away, wanting to ensure everything was in place before sharing the news. But the anticipation weighed on him, and he found himself watching the boy with a renewed sense of purpose. Every laugh, every drawing, every quiet moment of trust between them reinforced his decision. One afternoon, Thomas picked Jaden up from art class and decided to take him to the park. They sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, the sun casting a golden glow over the water. Jaden, Thomas began, his tone gentle but serious. There's something I want to talk to you about. The boy looked up, his expression curious. What is it? Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking a lot about us. About how much you've changed my life. And I realize that I want to make sure you never have to worry about what's going to happen next. Jaden tilted his head, unsure of where Thomas was going. What do you mean? Thomas smiled, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. I mean that I want to adopt you, to make it official. I want you to be my son. Jaden's eyes widened, his sketchpad slipping from his hands onto the bench. You mean it? Of course I mean it, Thomas said, his voice warm. You're already family to me, Jaden. This just makes it real for everyone else. For a moment, Jaden said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he threw his arms around Thomas, burying his face in his chest. I want that too, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I want to stay with you forever. Thomas held him tightly, his own eyes stinging with tears. You've got it, kid, forever. The final court hearing for the adoption was both nerve-wracking and emotional. Thomas stood beside Jaden in the courtroom, the boy clutching his hand tightly. The judge, the same woman who had granted him guardianship months earlier, looked over the paperwork with a small smile. Mr. Thomas, she said, her tone kind. It's clear that you've gone above and beyond for Jaden. And Jaden, she continued, turning her attention to the boy, it's obvious how much you mean to Mr. Thomas. Do you want this adoption to happen? Jaden nodded vigorously. Yes, Your Honor, he's my family. The judge's smile widened. Then it's my pleasure to approve this adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Thomas, and congratulations, Jaden. You're officially father and son. The room erupted in applause, but for Thomas and Jaden, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Thomas knelt down, pulling Jaden into a hug. We did it, he said, his voice filled with pride and relief. We're a family. Forever, Jaden whispered, his arms tightening around Thomas. That evening, back at the apartment, Thomas and Jaden celebrated with pizza, ice cream, and a marathon of Jaden's favorite movies. The boy was more animated than Thomas had ever seen. his laughter filling the space with a warmth that made the apartment truly feel like home. As they settled on the couch, Jaden leaned against Thomas, his sketchpad balanced on his lap. "Can I draw something for you?" he asked. "Anything you want, kid," Thomas replied. Jaden worked in silence for a while, his pencil moving swiftly across the paper. When he was finished, he held up the drawing with a shy smile. It was a portrait of the two of them, Thomas in his suit, Jaden in his favorite hoodie, standing in front of the apartment building. "This is us," Jaden said, "our family." Thomas looked at the drawing, his heart swelling. "It's perfect, just like us." For the first time in a long time, both Thomas and Jaden felt a sense of peace. They had fought for each other, and now they were ready to face whatever the future held, together as a family. The weeks after the adoption were a period of adjustment, but also of newfound joy. For the first time in years, both Thomas and Jaden could let their guard down. The uncertainty that had hung over their lives like a dark cloud was finally gone. They were no longer just navigating through a temporary arrangement. They were a family. Life in Thomas's apartment transformed into something warmer, something that felt alive. Jaden's sketches, once confined to his room, began to fill the walls of the living room and hallway. His laughter became a regular melody in the space, mixing with the clatter of dishes and the occasional hum of Thomas's classical music playlists. One Sunday morning, Thomas found Jaden sitting cross-legged on the floor, working intently on a new drawing. The boy had been up early, his energy buzzing ever since the adoption was finalized. "Want me, kid?" Thomas said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "What's got you so focused today?" Jaden looked up, his face lighting up with excitement. "I'm drawing our house." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Our house? You mean this apartment?" Jaden shook his head. "No, I mean the one we'll live in someday, with a yard and a dog." Thomas smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "A yard and a dog, huh? That's ambitious." Jaden shrugged, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "You said we could dream big." Thomas chuckled, ruffling Jaden's hair as he passed. "I did, didn't I?" As the months passed, Thomas made an effort to ensure Jaden's life was filled with opportunities and experiences. They visited museums and art galleries, traveled to the countryside for weekend getaways, and even adopted a small rescue dog, a scrappy terrier mix Jaden named Milo. The boy's joy at having a dog was infectious, and Milo quickly became the third member of their little family. On one such trip to the countryside, they stopped at a sprawling meadow surrounded by rolling hills. Jaden immediately pulled out his sketchpad, his eyes wide with inspiration. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "This is the place I've been drawing." Thomas watched him, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Then let's make sure we come back here often," he said. While their bond grew stronger, Jaden's healing became evident in other ways too. He began excelling in his art classes, his work earning recognition from teachers and peers alike. At a school art fair, one of Jaden's pieces, a vibrant landscape of the meadow they'd visited, was awarded first place. "Aha!" Thomas stood beside him as they accepted the ribbon, his chest tight with pride. "See?" Thomas whispered, leaning down. "I told you you're talented." Jaden grinned, holding up the ribbon like a trophy. "I couldn't have done it without you." Back at home, they celebrated the win with ice cream and a movie marathon. As they sat on the couch, Milo curled up at their feet. Jaden leaned his head against Thomas's arm. "Do you think Mom would have liked this?" Jaden asked quietly, his voice thoughtful. Thomas paused, his heart squeezing at the question. "I think she'd love it," he said, "and I think she'd be really proud of you." Jaden nodded, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I think so too." One evening, as they were winding down after dinner, Jaden surprised Thomas with another drawing. It was a detailed portrait of the two of them, standing in front of their apartment building with Milo at their feet. Above them, a bright blue sky stretched endlessly. "This is for you," Jaden said, handing it to Thomas. Thomas studied the drawing, his throat tightening with emotion. "This is incredible, Jaden, thank you." Jaden shrugged, his cheeks flushing. "You've done so much for me. I wanted to make something for you." Thomas smiled, setting the drawing on the table and pulling Jaden into a hug. "You've already given me more than I could ever ask for, kid. You've given me a family." Jaden hugged him back tightly, his voice muffled. "You gave me one too." As time went on, the challenges they'd faced became part of their story, not their present. The adoption wasn't just a legal arrangement, it was a declaration of the love and trust they had built. Thomas, once consumed by his career, found purpose in being a father, while Jaden discovered safety and belonging in a world he'd once feared. The walls of their home became a gallery of their journey, photos from trips, Jaden's award ribbons, and sketches of places they'd visited. Each piece told a story of resilience, hope, and the power of choosing to show up for one another. One day, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Jaden turned to Thomas. "Do you think we'll ever move to that house? With a yard?" Thomas chuckled, putting an arm around Jaden's shoulders. "I think anything's possible, Jaden. We've already made it this far, haven't we?" Jaden smiled, leaning into him. "Yeah, we have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them here, to this moment, to this family. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be home.